I suppose the other thing that comes out of that, George, is does this mean that we're in a clash of civilizations format now, that if the international order as an institutional rules-based order is fading away, that we're now facing what Huntington called a clash of civilizations in 1997, becoming more a feature of what becomes a multipolar world, that you've got a very clear Chinese sense of a civilization, you've got a Russian sense of its own civilization, you've got an India with a sense of its own civilization, and a West that's kind of undermining its own civilization through wokeness. Do you think this is the paradigm for the world going forward?
The danger in the West is you see China in your own image against your own template. So all this theorizing over the Thucydidean trap and the Peloponnesian War, that somehow China fits into a European paradigm. Of course, there's an equivalent danger on the other side, that China sees others in its own image. But it's a much smaller danger than Europeans seeing China in its own image. If China were like the Soviet Union, evangelical, expansionary, then yes, the clash is inevitable. But that's not China's nature. Their instinct is, when there's a crisis, shut the gates, keep out the foreigners, keep Chinese in. That's always been their instinct. It is not the Russian instinct. The Russian instinct is, when I'm threatened, I expand. The more I'm threatened, the more I have to expand. The Chinese instinct is, the more I'm threatened, the more I hunker down and block out foreigners. So for decades under Mao Zedong, when they were finding their own self, they just kept out foreigners. I know this personally because my mother came from China. My parents were married in China in 1937. A month later, the Japanese invaded, they rushed back. She left China as a young bride of 19. She could not go back to 1978. So during those decades, China turned inwards. That is the nature of Chinese society. So with China, with Russia, I'm not enough of an expert. I think there will be a clash. But with China, there's no necessary clash.
Mm. So in terms of the evolving world picture, and particularly in geoeconomic terms, as you said, the West seems to be facing an ongoing huge inflationary monetary problem. There's not that problem in China or in Southeast Asia, it seems. Why is that? How effectively? I was just looking at GDP figures for Singapore recently. Like the Singaporean economy is growing at about 3%, I think, per annum. Its interest rates are something like 4%, and its inflation is below 6%, about 5%. If any European or the Western economy had those kinds of figures, people would be jumping for joy, I think. How's Singapore done that? And I think the picture in China and Asia generally is not as bad as it is in Europe.
This year, ASEAN's trade with China will reach $1 trillion. It is significantly bigger than China's trade with the US, than China's trade with Europe, than Europe's trade with America. And in the coming years, the economies of Southeast Asia and China will grow together. And that's one reason why we are doing relatively well. May I make this point, because it may surprise you, that China was the least damaged economy during COVID. China was the last country to open up, which is the best strategy in an epidemic. China had the fewest number of deaths per million than any other major country. In 2020, while the rest of us were at home behind our screens, and then ordering from Amazon or whatever, and then looking forward to the parcels which are delivered through our doors. Who made the things in the parcels? They're all made in China. So for 3 years, China's factories produced for the entire world. In 2020, China's trade surplus, merchandise trade surplus, was $510 billion. In 2021, it became $670 billion US. In 2022, when you had the Shanghai lockdown and people said that China was really in horror and confusion, China's trade surplus went up to $870 billion. China did not have to print money, unlike Europe or America or Japan. And that's why today, while interest rates are trending up everywhere, in China, interest rates are trending down. This gives the Chinese government enormous policy flexibility. And if China does well, Hong Kong will do well, Singapore will do well.
Very good.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，护肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。